Welcome to Season 4 of Under the Sisterhood, Women's March for Mental Wellness. This season, we're diving deep into the intersection of women's mental health and overall wellness, bringing you thought-provoking conversations every Friday. We'll explore a wide range of topics, including how mental health impacts every stage of a woman's life, the intricate connections between physical and emotional well-being, and the role of practitioners who champion mental wellness. This podcast celebrates women, their resilience, and the incredible contributions they make to our world. I'm Elizabeth Elfenbein. Let's get under the hood. Today we're getting under the hood with Meredith Gold, a mother, daughter, sister, friend, women's advocate, and a licensed clinical social worker with more than 25 years of experience supporting individuals, families, and communities. From 2006 to 2023, Meredith worked full-time at YWCA Greenwich Domestic Abuse Services, where she served as the director for 7 years. In addition to working directly with trauma survivors, Meredith regularly presents on various topics for community events and parent groups. She delivers trainings to professionals in various fields, including family law attorneys, public and private school educators, medical and behavioral health providers, community workers, among others. Meredith also consults with service providers and private organizations about workplace issues related to harassment and domestic violence. Prior to her work in the field of domestic violence, Meredith coordinated a mentoring program for children whose parents were incarcerated. Meredith began her social work career as the youth director at the Greater Hartford JCC, where she oversaw the programming for elementary, middle school-aged youth, including being the director of an overnight summer camp. After decades of working in the nonprofit sector, Meredith launched a private psychotherapy practice where she uses non-judgmental authenticity and a little bit of humor to compassionately collaborate with clients as they explore thoughts, feelings, and beliefs to bring forth their strengths and identify barriers to standing in the way of personal growth. Wow, welcome, Meredith.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I'm so excited to be with you today.
Oh, I'm so excited. It's Season 4, Women's March for Mental Wellness, and I'm really looking forward to getting under the hood with you. So let's get going. I love this question, and I say it every single time, so I'm sorry, audience, if I'm boring you, but it's an important question because we all have inflection points in life. And what was that inflection point that got you into the mental health space?
So I have two inflection points that really stood out to me when I thought about this question. The first was a very long time ago. I was actually in kindergarten, and in music class, we were being taught America the beautiful song. And I was very upset when the line, crown thy good with brotherhood, was taught to us over and over. And it's kind of apropos with Under the Sisterhood, because I was really upset about why is it brotherhood when they mean everyone? Why isn't it sisterhood or personhood? At 5 years old, I was outraged about this. And so at a very young age, I recognized, or others recognized in me, this sense of fairness and social justice and what was right. And I definitely, at that time, did have an awareness that some people had more power than others, that, the playing field was not even. And that really got me upset at that young age. Many years later, I had a very circuitous route in my formal education. And after years of trying to figure out what I was going to be really and study, I was studying to be a secondary education teacher for math. And there was one course, it was co-taught by a social worker and an educator. And every paper or essay that I submitted came back with furious notes about, have you ever thought about social work? You would make a great social worker. And I never really did think about social work or understanding the field, but it was at that time that I really began to understand how someone's environment and environmental factors really impact their trajectory, our trajectory, and our way of achievement, certainly physical health, mental health, and that access to opportunities and resources could really, really impact someone's life. And so again, it sort of kicked in this innate sense about social justice and fairness. And I think that's really when it started for me.
Who thinks that at age 5? So for you to know that, to know the nuance in that, actually, maybe it's not such a nuance, is just amazing. And I think it's interesting when you look at the thread, and I'm putting my fingers across to who you were at 5, understanding social justice, to hearing that and seeing that as you're going through school and then the opportunity. So I'd love for you to share with the audience. So, these professors are like sort of in your ear saying, have you ever thought of this? What were your next steps and what was the journey like?
Well, like I said, I had a very circuitous route and explored lots of different ideas. I thought I would be a camp counselor for the rest of my life, and realized also that part of what I loved being in that role was the relationships that I had with my staff, who were mostly, young people, college age, high school age, and being a real mentor for them, helping them to sort of sit with their worries and fears and joy and excitement, and help sort of organize it with them was something that really was exciting to me. And so decided I was going to go for it. And when I was doing my graduate work, studying social work, I was placed as an intern in domestic abuse services, which was a field that I hadn't really given much thought to. Sure, I had taken some gender studies courses, and my social justice, fairness, stuff was certainly present. And I was placed at this agency and didn't really know much about it, but very quickly realized that this was the place for me. This was the work for me. This was the environment for me. And again, that 5-year-old big mouth kid as an intern started saying, huh, maybe we should think about doing things this way. Or what if we had a program that did this? We were very focused on crisis services when I started. And eventually I created a community education and prevention initiative in that program. And so just sort of really dug in, and 10 years into it, became the director, which was amazing. Found myself in that mentoring role again with staff, supporting mostly women, younger women in their journeys through their higher education, and figuring out what they wanted to do. But what was the most meaningful part of that work was my direct work with clients, with victims and survivors of domestic violence, and how much I learned from them, their resilience and bravery and courage in a way that isn't always recognized or seen from the outside in.
I'm just sitting with that thought, yeah, the resilience. And I like the way you just put it, the outside in. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. In some ways, I want to go right at that because that's sort of, you did so much work in your introduction. We talked about your work in domestic abuse. And I think that that's a great space and a great place to share today. First of all, you were also very young in your career. So I think what could be interesting, Meredith, is to go on your journey, what you were seeing as you were evolving in your career and advancing in this, what you were seeing and how you felt you could impact change as a psychotherapist in this capacity, or a director, overseeing that.
Yeah, sure. So I'll share a story that I often share. And when I did this work, leading the agency, I did a lot of community events and speaking to people who didn't know very much about domestic violence, or so they thought. So I like to tell this story that, imagine you're having a picnic on the side, in the woods, and on the side of a river, and you notice that as the river's flowing, that there are people flowing down the river who are having a hard time and drowning and needing help. And so you put your sandwich down and you go to the river and you help this person get out and make sure they're safe, and you give them a blanket. And a few minutes later, someone else comes down the river and you go and you help them out. And this continues through the afternoon, where you're just fishing people out of the water. And eventually you think, you know what, I'm going to take a walk to the top of the hill and find out why people are falling in the first place. And so what I realized is that we're always going to take care of people who need help. We're always going to fish those people out, support them, help them get what they need. And if we really want to make a dent, though, in this issue, we have to talk about prevention, and we have to talk about it in a couple of different ways. The first initially is primary prevention, which means really stopping it before it starts. So we launched programs directed at young people. at the high school level, teaching about teen dating violence, teaching about healthy relationships, eye-opening concepts to talk about with teenagers who are so in the moment. I always like to think of them as little amplifiers. Whatever their feeling or experiences is up to an 11. So, this is the most important relationship. I'll never love this person ever again. I'll never love anyone else as much as I love this person again. And it's easy to get swept up. So really stepping back and teaching teens about boundaries and consent. And then even at the younger ages, starting as young as kindergarten, we were teaching kids about communication, feelings identification, empathy, conflict negotiation, right? So, yeah, you might be on the playground and someone has the swing that you want, and that could feel really upsetting, and you could be really, really angry, and that's okay. But are you going to go and push them off the swing and take it, right? So, teaching these nuances to children. And then at the middle school level, also, when relationships start to change as friendships into more romantic relationships, but even healthy relationships within a friendship, understanding boundaries and consent. So that was a really important piece of the work. And another aspect of prevention is just educating the community, sort of what we're doing here today, planting seeds for people to look at this issue in a different way, start to maybe recognize things that they've experienced themselves that never put the label of domestic violence or control. It was just a bad relationship, or, my last partner was really not that great of a person. And also people recognizing signs in their friends and family, training professionals, not domestic violence professionals, but in other fields, such as the mental health field or attorneys, medical providers, to look for signs in the people that they work with, to recognize if someone might be experiencing this and not know how to fix it, not necessarily know how to intervene, but how to refer to the experts in the field to get people help. And the last part of prevention, or another part of prevention that we really focused on, 90% of domestic violence is perpetrated by men. And saying that, most men are not violent. Most men are good and safe and not violent. But out of the number of people who do perpetrate domestic violence, 90% are men. And so we need to look at what's happening with men that they are perpetrating these kinds of behaviors. When we think about domestic violence, it's such a gendered issue. We usually think, oh, it's a woman's issue. This is a women's problem. And yes, women are certainly impacted. And we need to look at what's going on with men and try to change fundamental attitudes, beliefs, what's socially acceptable behavior. And so, as I said, 90% of men are not abusive, are not violent. So let's say 1 out of 10 men are. That one abuser relies on the silence and sort of unspoken consent of the other 9 men. So, as we know, domestic violence lives in the shadows, it lives in secret. And so it takes other people, and in this case, the example I'm talking about right now, with social capital, with influence, to be able to call out the behaviors. And that doesn't necessarily only mean intervening when something really terrible is happening in the extreme, but derogatory comments, sexist jokes, these kinds of things. And it doesn't also mean that someone needs to be, a superhero running around with a cape. It doesn't mean that they need to stand on a soapbox, but even saying something like, that's not cool, could totally take the power away from someone. I'm reminded as I'm talking to you now of an initiative that we did that I was very, very proud of, which was working with the high school football team in our town. And the head coach really understood the social capital and the power that he, as a head football coach, had in a small suburban town, and also his players, and saw teaching these players in a way that added to their concept of leadership. And so he dedicated time during their football practice for myself and colleagues to come in and talk to these young boys about the role that they can play, not to wag our fingers at them and to say, don't be bad boys, but to help them understand the power that they could have as being what we called an upstander instead of a bystander, to really set the norm for what's socially acceptable in a positive way.
Wow. Wow. I'm just sitting here and there's so much to unpack with prevention, the whole experience, because prevention, it's so interesting as I'm hearing you speak, Meredith, I'm hearing on a community level, in education, in school systems, in system levels. And I think it's really tricky. And you can teach the kids at 5 what is and what isn't socially acceptable as they age and all of that. But what's going on in the home? We know and I'd be curious to get your take on this, generations of violence. It's an intergenerational thing. I just applaud you for the work you're doing. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that because you also see patients, you see clients, if you will, on a one-on-one level. When you look at it from that perspective, the family dynamic, can you talk a little bit about your experience there and because the one thing you said I thought was really good is for us to recognize what it looks like.
So it's really important, again, to emphasize that, well, maybe I haven't said this yet, but most people that do grow up in an abusive home will not necessarily repeat that pattern. Most people, that doesn't mean that they won't be impacted by what they experienced or what they've, witnessed, but most people, they're not doomed to repeat this pattern. That being said, the opposite of that stat is true, that out of the people who are abusive, if you look at that pool, most of them did come from an abusive home or witness violence in some way, interpersonal violence. And so that's a nuance, but a very important distinction. And so absolutely, domestic violence, intimate partner violence is a learned behavior. And certainly what happens in the home can impact. And we have to talk about culturally at the societal level, pop culture, the lessons that we learn about gender roles, what it means to be in a relationship with someone, what are we taught to be? And, we in our culture, there's a real value of being selfless, right? And sacrificing for others and giving. And absolutely, we need to take care of each other. And we need to teach young people to take care of themselves, that being selfish is not selfish, is that, we need to put ourselves first. And so that I think gets overlooked. And when we combine that with someone maybe coming from a home where there's very traditional roles, religion, culture, ethnicity can play a factor in the way that people are taught about what is family, what is a relationship, how do we interact, what's okay, what's not okay. Certainly, as I mentioned before, the culture of silence around domestic violence, I think we've all heard this saying over the years that, we don't air our dirty laundry as a family, that what goes on behind closed doors is a private matter. And that's changed a little bit, but generally that's still true. So people come up with the understanding that this is private, this is secret, it's nobody's business, and that there's a lot of shame that gets tied up.
Yeah, I mean, I think that really, I'm struck by this part of the conversation and by I like the distinction between the most people who come from that environment don't do it, but of the people who do it, they do come from that background. It's so interesting to me because going in and having those prevention conversations when you've come from that environment, like, how do you see the integration of like changed behaviors when you get in younger and you have, these children or say adolescents, teenagers who come from these spaces? Are you able to or pivot them from that perspective? Sometimes you put and implement a program and you don't have opportunity to see it down the line, but I'm curious if you did, if you've noticed the trends there.
Really difficult question. Prevention is so difficult to measure because how do you measure something that hasn't happened? How do you know it's worth it? What you're doing is even making a difference. In some ways, we don't know. We can look at overall statistics, we can look at the big picture. The problem with an issue like domestic violence is that we don't talk about it. Most incidents go unreported. So, whatever stats we have, and I'll share some, are drastically underreported. So we know that globally, around 1 in 3 women and 1 in 10 men will experience intimate partner violence at some point over their lifetime. So that's staggering when you think about it. And I'll share, there's a statistic around breast cancer. We know that about 1 in 8 women will experience breast cancer. over their lifetime. So when not to compare these issues, they're both terrible. We don't want anyone that we care about to have to face either of these issues. But when you think about breast cancer awareness, we think pink, we see the ribbons, we see the walks, we see the joy in the fundraising and in the survivors who speak out and share their stories. It's really easy to get behind and support the issue of breast cancer. And there's a really clear enemy, which is cancer. When we deal with domestic violence, which impacts at least twice, maybe three times as many women, we don't hear about it. It's still uncomfortable to talk about. There's a stigma around it. And so the numbers that we do know are even less, are probably even more than what's being reported. And so this idea of how do we know? There's lots of measures. We can look at crime, right, from the law enforcement perspective. We know, though, that victims of domestic violence, there are a lot of reasons why they may not want to report to the police. And that could be because most abusers are not actually held accountable by the criminal justice system, but also imagine you're walking down the street and someone, comes and slaps you and steals your pocketbook. Okay, you call the police and maybe they get arrested or maybe they don't, but then you're probably not going to see that person ever again. If you're calling the police when somebody in your own home has committed a crime against you, it's a lot more complicated than that. The most obvious is that it actually could be more dangerous. It could elevate the level of danger. Someone goes, let's say they do spend the night in jail, they're coming home the next day. Let's say they do go to court. Well, their victim, who maybe is their partner, is sitting in the same courtroom having to share these intimate details of their life at home. It could be if somebody is taken by the police and winds up in jail, well, maybe that person was the sole breadwinner at home. And if there's children and now my partner can't work and now he's mad at me because I called the police and now I'm home, it's very complicated. And not to mention, there's a lot of shame, as we discussed. When someone gets arrested in our town, their name goes in the local paper. So a lot of people don't want their partner to be listed in the paper. It doesn't always work. Trying to hold someone accountable doesn't work. Things could actually get worse. And the most important reason, which I think is often not always acknowledged and hard to understand, is that victims often love their abusers. An abusive relationship is not all bad all the time. There are moments where it could be joyful. It could be moments where there's kindness and love. And so there's a connection to this person. There could be real love underneath. And it's very hard to leave, to hold someone accountable, certainly call the police when it's somebody that you love. One thing I thought I'd share in talking about this is the metaphor of the frog in the pot. So many people will look at a situation and look at a victim and say, how could she let herself get in this situation? Why did she stay in that situation? And so domestic violence can very often be like a frog in a pot, which I guess this is really true. If you were to take a pot of boiling water and put a baby frog or grown-up frog in the pot, they would recognize the water's hot and they would jump right out. If you were to take a pot of cold water and put a baby frog in the cold water and slowly turn up the heat, the frog doesn't realize that the water is getting hotter and hotter and will not jump out and will often stay till they're burned up. And so this analogy is really important in domestic violence because it is insidious. Nobody goes out on a first date with someone and is called a jerk or a loser or an idiot and then decides, oh, I think I'm going to keep seeing this person. It doesn't start out that way. These behaviors develop slowly over time, and before you know it, you're in the hot water.
I have to pause for a second and take this in. Yeah, that is a great analogy, and I really appreciate your sharing your expertise around this. I want to just acknowledge you, Meredith, and the amazing work you're doing in both seeing this because holding space for this for so many years must have been a lot. How did you do it? You said earlier that when you got into this work, you said, this is where I want to be. What attracted you to it, and why did you stay in it?
I think initially it was this sort of outrage around the justice factor. Like, this is so unfair. This is so not right. And why aren't we up in the streets screaming this and letting this happen, especially when it impacts so many people. What kept me in it was the my environment that I was in doing this work with the most incredible team of mostly women, but not all, who were so dedicated to this issue as well, who this is not a job that you clock in and clock out. This is something, it becomes a part of you. It becomes a part of the way you speak and the way you move through the world. And I was so, so fortunate to be surrounded with the most incredible group of teachers and mentors and colleagues and friends who really became family. And we spent a lot of time supporting each other in this work. You know, we all know about vicarious trauma, and our clients would come in and sometimes talk about the things that they were experiencing as if they were reading a grocery list, you know, and we would walk out and say, I can't believe what I just heard. And doesn't she realize? And you could go lean up in the doorway of a colleague and say, do you have a minute? I just need to put this somewhere. It didn't help. It wasn't the worst thing in the world that we were all trained in the social services field also. So we knew how to support each other. But to be able to create time and space for those moments to keep ourselves going, to keep each other going. During COVID, was a really interesting time to do this work when we were all at home operating two hotlines through a network of cell phones and a shelter, and still maintaining to do all of the work that we had always done. And during that time especially, it became so clear how important it was for us to stay connected to each other. We had our ongoing individual support meetings, our ongoing weekly, sometimes twice a week, all staff meetings. And we always took time to, of course, cover the bases, go through our agenda, do the work we needed to do, and save space that was just about connection on a human level. A colleague of mine invented what she called the she share, which we started pretty much every meeting with a she share. And she, being so creative, came up with all kinds of fun prompts like, who was your first celebrity crush? How early can you remember? And we just be silly together, connect on that human level to be able to put on our suits of armor and go back to the work. So that was a really important piece of it.
No, I like that. I like this starting that with that icebreaker that allows, because it sort of just takes that weight off the shoulders. Because I would imagine doing that kind of work, there's a heaviness to it. But you guys are also trained, so boundaries, right? I'd love for you to share like what type of boundaries. So for you to do this type of really intense work, and even if you're not doing as much domestic violence work today in your private practice, it's still you're absorbing other people's stories and their real time, traumas and dramas and everything. How do you move through it? And I think that was a nice phrase, by the way, that you said, moving through it. What are your strategies for boundaries and everything?
Boundaries is a big trigger word in our field. We have to maintain our boundaries. We have our code of ethics. On that very plain level, we have to maintain our boundaries. And we have to be able to connect with the clients and the people that we work with. And there is some debate in the field about sort of abandoning the traditional Freudian blank slate relationship or lack of with a client that you're working with. I think a more contemporary view is recognizing that it's okay to be a human with your clients. It's okay to share a laugh. You don't want to share something that whatever you do share, it has to be in the best interest of your client, right? Your client isn't there to meet your needs of connection. It's really about maintaining the view of serving them. But more and more research is pointing to the fact that the most effective part of therapy is the therapeutic relationship. So there are a lot of modalities out there now that are evidence-based and amazing and can really help people. And given all of those modalities, the most important piece is the human connection. So that is something that I think about every day. That goes with something we've spoken about is this idea of being authentic. I think even though your clients come in and see you as a professional or the expert in the room, to be able to be your authentic self, whether you're with a client or a colleague or a child or a supervisor is a really important skill and something I really try to pay attention to be mostly the same person I am in any room that I walk in. But to speak to this idea of not taking it on is really important. To practice self-care, to practice, finding your own sources of support. It's difficult to balance showing up authentically with someone, sitting in their chaos, in their trauma, in their story, and then zipping yourself back up. So yeah, so self-care is really important, boundaries are really important, and support. I'm lucky enough to continue to work with some of the people that I worked in the past, and that camaraderie, those friendships are everything to me. And I don't think, I think being in private practice can be very isolating and lonely. And you also want to be able to check in, like, am I on the right track with where I'm going with this client? Or I'm really stuck with this client. Do you have any ideas? It can be a really important piece of the work.
I know that your practice is relatively new, I should say, but that you will attract many people for being that. And so I think that this authenticity, this new sort of way of thinking and doing therapy is fantastic. And I would imagine, just because when we look at society today, we look at this younger generation, we look at the kids, the younger generation. I know I've spoken with several different types of therapists and social workers that these kids are so sophisticated. They know so much. They come in and, likely they're going to want to just share. And so the more you create that space where they feel comfortable, the better it is, right?
Yes, I think so. And, you're tapping into something that is crucial that we keep in our minds all the time now of this, we're using this word connection. And in some ways, with technology and social media, we are more connected than we've ever been. And we are more disconnected from each other than we've ever been. This idea of loneliness, our Surgeon General came out and mental health crisis in our country because of loneliness, where, people are walking around looking at their screens. We absorb most of our information that way about the world. And when there are moments for human connection, it can feel scary, especially for young people who, are not used to even picking up the phone to order a pizza. Making a phone call can be really scary for this younger generation who are so used to everything being digital and texting. So being face to face with a therapist can feel really scary, really unsafe, and not having the skills. And that sort of loops back to some of the things I was talking about before about teaching mostly young people, but some adults need to still learn too, how to have a relationship. These are things that we don't learn in school. And so one of the examples is, most kids, when they come up, they get to a certain grade and they do have sex education, right? They have sex ed, and they're taught a lot of mechanics, taught a lot of, like, brass tacks about what to do and what goes where and what happens and all of these things. But nobody's really talking about, how do you have a conversation with your partner about physical intimacy or anything else for that matter? How do you make sure that you're able to speak what your boundaries are, what you're comfortable with, how to make sure that you can recognize what other people's boundaries are? If there is a conflict, how do you get around, how do you negotiate that? And so these are specific skills that we need to learn and continue to learn.
But you jogged something that you said earlier, which is the skill of relationship. I mean, I know I had no idea. I came from, my parents are divorced. I didn't know what a good relationship looked like. How would I know how to create a good relationship? I mean, you can try and break the cycle, but certain things are sort of, intergenerational, if you will. And so I think that's a really good thing. If you can, as therapists and in your line of, in your space, that goes back to your prevention conversation around educating around what does a relationship look like? And then you made the reference, actually, Meredith, you said, whether it's, different cultures, different backgrounds, ethnicities, those relationships look even different. And so how the domestic violence shows up in that way. But I'm talking about, if we look at the positive side of it, how do we just show up in a relationship? And so I think you're right. It is, if we could teach it to young kids, if we could teach it to adults. I mean, it's never too late to change. It's hard to change, but it is not too late to understand what a good relationship, that exchange and that feeling comfortable, like, back to that authenticity as well, right?
Absolutely. And I'll tell you, in my practice now, which, is unfolding in a way that is surprising in some ways to me, having this, long background in one area and then meeting all different kinds of people with different kinds of challenges, but the one common thread is almost everyone is coming because there's some kind of challenge in important relationship. It's always about the relationship. And just like you said, whether it's a partner, a child, an adult child, a parent, a brother, I mean, that's what makes us human, right? Is how we relate to each other. And none of this happens in a vacuum. And if there is conflict or discord in one relationship, there's no way that it doesn't impact other areas of our lives. So when people come into therapy or seeking help or support, sometimes there isn't a specific identifiable, issue that they want to work on, and it always comes down to relationships.
Again, I'm going to get on to this next question, but I think about when we began the journey, 5-year-old Meredith and her social justice. If you look at social justice and the intersection of relationships, right, that's kind of interesting, right? Like that's really at the heart of what you're doing because you get to be that activist, that person who has this fund. I mean, that's just fantastic. I just applaud you. I'm curious, like, how are you marching for mental wellness? And you can answer this on a personal level, on a professional, and on a combination. I'm really curious.
I love the language of marching for mental wellness because it's something that's ongoing, right? It's the active verb of it. It's not how did you do this or how it's an ongoing process. And it is a little bit of a trek, right? This isn't easy to do. And it's something that I think we need to be deliberate about, these concepts that we're trying to support other people with for ourselves. And believe me, none of us have it together. None of us have it right, which is again brings me to it's ongoing. But to be mindful, I think is really, to me, the core of what all of this is about, to be deliberate, to be aware. And I've learned this from my colleagues and mentors. We can't control what happens around us. We can't. We can't ignore it. We can't take it on all the time. But if we can think about ourselves and developing ourselves to be an anchor or a lighthouse for ourselves to be able to brave the storm, I think is most important. To be able to kind of take stock, right? We're not going to be in denial about a challenge or what's happening. We have to look at it, we have to face it, and then we get to decide what we want to do. So having choice, recognizing that pretty much everything we do is choice. This is a really important piece of the empowerment work. We have a saying, and you might have to bleep me out for saying this, but sometimes our choices in life, the options are shitty and shittier, right? But we're still making a choice, and there's power in that. So that's something that I personally try to remind myself and practice, and also help the clients that I work with focus on as well. You get to be in charge.
There's two things that stick out with me. I love that. One is the agency side of it, the empowerment. Even if the choices are shitty and shittier, you have the agency to decide which direction you want to go in. And then the other thing that really resonates with me, and I think that doing the work on self and being committed and intentional was what you suggested. And I think that's really important. And you use the word role modeling, like how you show up. And I think, when we think about it, we don't realize the impact of our behaviors. And even, if we're doing it as a mother, as a colleague, as a therapist, of course, you have to role model it. But you're right, you have to put it in practice into everyday life. We're all human, we make mistakes. But if you can be intentional and thoughtful about it, I think that's really great. I love that answer to marching for mental wellness. I'm curious, we have one last question, but I don't know if there's anything else, Meredith, separate that you want to share before I ask the last question.
I don't think so. I think that, the work that you're doing, Elizabeth, is so important in raising voices. I think, going along with the last piece that we were just discussing, to give voice or to allow space for other voices who don't necessarily have access or the microphone, I think is really important. So I appreciate what you're doing so much.
Well, thank you for that. And it's funny that you just mentioned that because I was thinking as you were describing the whole, you used the metaphor of the river, but as you were describing the whole domestic violence thing and the fact that there's so much shame attached to it and it's not talked about, I think the greatest thing we could do in this community is to give voice to it. So thank you for acknowledging that. I did, I meant to say something about that. I think it's critical. And so the work you're doing is essential and the work that you've done. Meredith, this is your platform to give a message, to leave women of all ages, of all backgrounds, of all cultures a message. What do you want to leave them with?
The hard one because my first instinct is to say, who am I to give a message? We all have a message. We all have something to contribute. We all have faults and we all have strengths. And so, I think for me, one of the most important pieces is to recognize the strengths, recognize the faults, and acceptance. Accept what we can control, let go of what we can't. Doesn't mean we have to be happy about it, right? Acceptance doesn't mean that is not the same thing as approval, right? So we accept that this is what it is, and what can I do about it? How can I continue in a way that's aligned with my internal moral compass, with what I want to achieve, with my boundaries, that being really deliberate in how we move through the world, I think it takes work. That would be my message, is to be very mindful and aware of how you move through the world and make choice. You get to decide.
How do you move through the world? I think that's a great message of being intentional and aware. I really, I could talk to you for hours. Thank you so much for getting under the hood with me. And thank you for the amazing work you're doing to help make the world a better world.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And likewise, back to you. I've really enjoyed talking with you. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Under the Sisterhood. If you haven't already, please give us a quick rating and review on Apple or Spotify. And make sure to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn so you can hear from more amazing women. This podcast is created and hosted by Under the Sisterhood LLC and Elizabeth Elfenbein, produced by Elizabeth Elfenbein and Matt Butler, and edited by Matt Butler. The music is by Ayla Schaefer. Her song, Rose.